One of your favorite people, Victoria Woodhull. Woodhull, of course, is the first female candidate for President of the United States, supported by no less than Stanton and Anthony, the sort of doyens of the women's suffrage movement. But she herself is I'd say she's exactly the opposite of what the domestic code stood for. That is, she grows up very poor in a family which is disorganized and dysfunctional. She marries very young. She marries a drunkard, an alcoholic who she divorces because he's an alcoholic. And then with her sister, she moves to New York, and using a kind of spirituality bequeathed to her by her mother, who also imagined herself a kind of spiritualist, she begins to attract people into a philosophy which some people have called the free love philosophy. And it's the notion that women are responsible to nobody but God and themselves, and that they cannot be responsible to men, and moreover, that they are entitled to, in some sense, not only control their own bodies, but that they deserve sexual pleasure, but they also deserve to be free of the control of any particular man. So they don't, she particularly doesn't think marriage is a good thing, although she's not rejecting monogamy. She just thinks the state has nothing to do with marriage, or should have nothing to do with marriage. This is between two individuals and their own spiritual beliefs.
Woodhull's a remarkable woman, and we're going to have our students look at some of her speeches. And as you said, she turns the law in a way on its head. She points out that the very suggestion that the law is necessary to govern women undermines any notion of their virtue. She has a quote where she says she can think of no grosser insult to women than, quote, to insinuate that she is honest and virtuous only because the law compels her to be so.
Well, that's exactly right? A woman should be honest and virtuous, or will be honest and virtuous, if she is loyal to herself and her own instincts. And the law, as it is embodied by the domestic code, laws of inheritance, laws of domicile, etc., which push women into obedience to husband, do a disservice to women in general, but they also prevent them from fulfilling their divine mission, if you like, of being whatever good they can be, good mothers, good, wives even, but good individuals. And that sort of notion is it's a powerful, powerful pull. Now, I don't want to exaggerate, because she has a very interesting and clearly committed following, but much of it is notoriety rather than, actual belief in her belief systems. And it is interesting that one of the major claims of this generation of feminists, if you want to call them that, or suffragists or women's rights advocates, is the right to control their own bodies, by which they mean something quite different from what we mean. What they insist on is that women should be able to control themselves, that they do, but that men need to have self-control. And that what we now call marital rape, for example, is itself a crime. And that men should be encouraged to exercise self-discipline. And they do this in the most specific ways, arguing that men should simply control themselves. Abstinence, they say, is good for the soul. It's good for a marriage, it's good for the soul, and so on. And there's Victoria Woodhull actually affirming this in some way and saying, yes, women have the right to, have their own sexuality. Of course, in those days, perhaps I don't even need to say this, a woman who refused to sleep with her husband or refused to have sex with her husband could be divorced by the husband. In other words, it was his right to have sex whenever he wanted and however he wanted. One of the things, I'm going on a bit about this, but one of the things Victoria Woodhull was noted for doing was she and her sister Tennessee, who ran a kind of weekly newspaper, published letters from women writing to them, dear Victoria, you should know that my husband, he has sex with me every night and sometimes again in the morning, and I can't stand it anymore. And to see those letters published in a paper, that was a scandal in and of itself.
I believe she ended up in jail for it at one point.
She did.
Under the Comstock laws for obscenity.
Right, which were for sending the paper through the mails, not for actually publishing it. Right. But yes, she did.
Well, and this, in a way, it raises so many issues that we're going to come back to. Rights of women to their own bodies, birth control, the relationship between husband and wife, but also the role of women in the larger political sphere. And coming back around to the question we started with, the idea of moral purity that emerges in this moment does seem to govern much of what is expected of women, the sort of gendered imagination, as you spoke about in the introduction. As we wrap this section up, how might we think about that and the challenges to it going forward in a way?
Here was a moment at which women actually could acknowledge sexual desire, which they hadn't been able to do in the pre-Civil War period, by and large. You'd have to be a prostitute to acknowledge it. You could acknowledge sexual desire, but you could also say that you wanted to limit your family. But if you did that, you could not rely on birth control. They were primitive, but they were primitive syringes, there were primitive diaphragms in those early years. Using those was immoral. No contraception. What you had to do was rely on self-discipline. So just as you were asking self-discipline or self-control of the men, so women asked it of themselves. And the moral purity movement was to say, we can control our sexual relationships. Think of the home here. So the lady of the early part of the 19th century who was pious, pure, domestic, and submissive was now saying, I'm still pious, I'm still pure, I'm still committed to staying in the home, but submissive? So to be able to say to a man who had legally an absolute right to have his wife whenever he wanted and however he wanted, to be able to say, no, you may have that legal right, but as what Victoria Woodhull would have said, you don't really have that right at all. Morally, you and I, we need to negotiate that. And there's another, sort of path into the notion of masculinity.